If you ask the tourists why the rangers lock the heavy steel gates to the deeper trails at sundown, they'll tell you it's to protect people from the black bears.
Let him believe that.
It's a comforting, easily digestible lie.
The truth is, those gates aren't there to keep the wildlife away from you.
They're there to keep you away from the things that don't belong in the brochures. I spent 35 years as a backcountry guide and tracker in these ancient mountains. I know every ridge, every hollow, and every unmarked game trail all the way to the Carolina border. I've survived flash floods, sudden winter blizzards, and close encounters with territorial predators. The kind of stuff that'd make a city guy never want to leave the safety of his living room again. But I haven't stepped foot in those woods after dark for 7 years.
Not since the night I tracked a man who walked into the tree line as a human being.
And walked out as something else entirely.
To understand what happened out there in the freezing dark, you gotta understand the man I was looking for.
His name was Thomas. For a decade, Thomas and I were brothers in everything but blood. We built a high-end wilderness survival and outfitting business right from the ground up. I was the silent partner,
The tracker.
I was the one who actually knew how to navigate the deep brush, read the weather, and keep our wealthy clients alive.
Thomas was the face of the operation.
He had this effortless charisma and a silver tongue that could convince tourists to pay thousands of dollars for a rugged, authentic Appalachian experience. We were a perfect team, right up until the money started rolling in.
People say success changes you, but I've always believed it really just unmasks who you already are.
Thomas started packing our schedules just to pull in more cash.
He'd take massive groups of clueless tourists straight into restricted zones without a permit. He promised them secret waterfalls the rangers had locked down for a reason.
I told him over and over he was playing a dangerous game. I warned him, these mountains don't give a damn about his profit margins.
But he just flashed that $1 million smile and brushed me off.
Then came the afternoon I was stuck in town grabbing new gear. Thomas decided to drag a bunch of rookies up a nasty shale ridge in a rainstorm. The rocks turned pure ice, and he was completely out of his depth. The inevitable happened when a young woman slipped and shattered her leg. She nearly froze to death before the choppers could even reach her. They had to winch her right out of the canopy just to keep her breathing.
When the feds came knocking, Thomas didn't man up and take the blame.
Instead, he sat in some sterile office and forged my signature on the paperwork.
He looked them dead in the eye and said the illegal trek was my idea.
He swore he was just following my instructions, throwing me right under the bus.
Thanks to his lies, they stripped my guiding license and wrecked my livelihood. I lost my entire reputation in a community I'd spent my whole life building.
Thomas kept the business, slapped a flashy new name on it, and pocketed everything. He left me with nothing but a drained bank account and a lot of bitterness. He kept living the high life while I got tossed out in the cold.
I packed up and retreated to this tiny, isolated cabin on the edge of Gatlinburg.
I cut ties with him and the rest of the world we'd built. I just let the quiet of those ancient pines swallow me whole. Out there in the middle of nowhere, I spent years nursing this quiet resentment. I wanted to see him fail, man. I used to sit on my porch, hoping the mountains would eventually humble him. 7 long years went by like that. I got older, quieter, and just kind of learned to live with how unfair it all was. I never actually expected the mountains to answer my dark little wishes. Then, on a freezing Tuesday morning in late November, the quiet of my isolation finally broke. There was a heavy, frantic knock on my cabin door that echoed through the trees. I opened the heavy door to find Eleanor, Thomas's wife, standing on the porch. Bitter memory,
I hadn't seen her since the legal fallout that ruined me.
She looked completely hollowed out. Her eyes were red and sunken from days of sleepless crying.
She was clutching a damp tissue in her trembling hands.
She looked like a fragile ghost standing there in the freezing cold. She didn't bother with pleasantries or apologies for the bitter past.
She just looked up at me with absolute desperation and said Thomas was gone.
He'd vanished without a trace 12 days ago.
He went missing while scouting a new, highly restricted valley.
It was deep in the southern sector of the national park,
an area the older locals know to avoid, called Blackwood Hollow.
It's a place so dense and choked with old-growth rhododendron. Even the sun barely touches the forest floor at high noon. It's a suffocating stretch of woods that just swallows you whole. The park rangers had already searched the area for 5 grueling days. They brought in specialized tracking dogs and helicopters with thermal imaging.
Dozens of trained volunteers combed the entire grid. Despite all that manpower, they found absolutely nothing.
There wasn't a candy wrapper, not a single footprint in the mud.
Not even a shred of torn nylon clothing to prove he was there. The official search had finally been called off. There was a massive winter storm rolling over the peaks.
It threatened to bury the higher elevations in feet of freezing snow.
The authorities gently told Eleanor to go home and prepare for the worst. They told her the mountains had claimed him. It was only a matter of time before the elements finished the job. But Eleanor refused to accept it. She looked at me with this desperate, crushing grief, and it broke straight through the thick walls of my bitterness.
She knew exactly what Thomas had done to me.
She knew he'd ruined my life.
But she also knew I was the only man who could read those woods. She begged me to find him. She offered me money, whatever I wanted.
I didn't want her money. Honestly, a dark part of me just wanted to shut the door
and let Thomas rot in the frozen bed he'd made for himself.
But looking at Eleanor, I realized something.
This wasn't about saving Thomas anymore.
I wanted to find him broken and utterly defeated.
I wanted to pull him out of the dirt and make him look me in the eye. I wanted him to know the man he destroyed was the reason he was still breathing. It was a dark, petty, and vindictive motivation. I admit that freely, but it was enough to make me pack my gear.
I left at first light the next morning.
The drive to Blackwood Hollow was a quiet, tense journey. The Great Smoky Mountains are some of the oldest mountains on Earth. They've been standing for hundreds of millions of years, long before human beings ever figured out how to make fire. They just watch the ages pass by. When you step into the deep, forgotten sections, where the paved tourist trails finally end, that's where the true unforgiving wilderness begins. You can physically feel that immense age pressing down on you. It's a heavy, suffocating feeling. It reminds you just how small you really are.
The air smells different out there.
It smells like damp earth and decaying wood and ancient buried secrets. I bypassed the main trailheads and hiked in through a dried, rocky creek bed. I was deliberately avoiding the ranger patrols. I knew exactly how Thomas thought, and I knew exactly where he'd go. He always preferred the path of least resistance. He'd followed the natural contours of the valley floors rather than fighting the elevation. By noon, I was miles beyond the official search grid. The woods out there were unnervingly still. Usually, the Appalachian forest is a constant symphony of noise. You hear the wind rattling the branches, the squirrels, the hawks. But as I pushed deeper into the throat of the hollow, the volume of the world just seemed to turn down. The birds vanished. The wind died completely. The silence became absolute.
It was ringing in my ears, like a physical pressure.
It's the kind of unnatural silence that tells a seasoned woodsman he just crossed a boundary he should have respected.
But I'd pushed on anyway.
I was fueled by my own stubborn pride and the burning desire to see my betrayer brought low.
It took me 8 hours of agonizingly slow, meticulous tracking to find the first sign.
It was incredibly subtle. Just a small patch of green moss on a rotting log that had been compressed,
and a freshly snapped twig on a mountain laurel bush at about waist height.
I crouched down, running my bare fingers over the broken wood.
The sap was dry, meaning it was an old break.
Maybe a week or more,
but the height and angle meant it was broken by a human being pushing through the brush.
I followed that invisible thread, reading the forest floor the way a scholar reads a fragile, ancient text. 2 miles later, as the afternoon light began to fail, I found his camp. It was tucked awkwardly beneath the jagged overhang of a massive limestone boulder.
The very moment I laid eyes on that camp,
the cold, heavy knot of unease in my stomach tightened into genuine dread. Something was terribly, fundamentally wrong here.
Thomas was an arrogant man, but he was never a careless one. His high-end, bright orange expedition tent was fully erected, but the heavy rainfly was violently torn to shreds. It was just flapping uselessly in the still, freezing air.
I could see his insulated sleeping bag still inside, tangled, muddy, and damp. But what really chilled my blood was his gear. His expensive titanium camp stove, his water filtration system, and his heavy winter survival coat were all sitting neatly on a flat rock just outside the tent. His emergency satellite beacon was right there with them.
Thomas would never abandon his survival gear like this.
He was way too vain and far too obsessed with his own comfort and safety. Leaving this stuff behind went against every instinct he had.
The only reason a man leaves his camp without his heavy winter coat in freezing weather
is if he left in a blind, absolute panic.
Either that, or he didn't leave on his own.
Chilling conclusion, he was dragged out of it. I immediately drew my sidearm,
a heavy caliber revolver I always carried in the deep backcountry.
I checked the cylinder and began to slowly circle the campsite.
Every shadow in the brush suddenly looked like a threat.
I widened my radius, sweeping the ground, desperately looking for tracks. The earth here was hard, covered in a thick, slippery layer of frozen pine needles.
It made it incredibly difficult to pull a clear print from the dirt. But eventually, near the edge of a steep, plunging ravine, I found them.
There were clear footprints stamped into the frost. They belonged to a pair of heavy, size 11 mountaineering boots. I knew those treads instantly. They were Thomas's boots. I crouched down low to the freezing ground, studying the stride and measuring the distance between the heel strikes.
The distance between the left and right foot was dangerously wide, and the heel impacts were deep and frantic, kicking up frozen dirt.
He had been running. He had been sprinting blindly through the dense, thorny brush in the pitch black. I immediately scoured the dirt for a second set of prints.
If he was running that hard without his coat, something terrifying had to be chasing him.
I got down on my hands and knees, looking for paw prints or claw gouges, but there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. No pursuing tracks anywhere.
Just Thomas running for his life from something that didn't leave a trace.
I started following his trail down into the steep ravine. Daylight was dying fast, and the temperature was plummeting. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to make camp and wait for morning. But the trail was hot, and my obsession with finding him had completely overridden my better judgment. I clicked on my headlamp and kept moving down into the dark.
This is the part of the story that stops making sense to anyone who hasn't been out here alone.
As I followed his frantic boot prints along the freezing creek bed, the tracks started to change.
At first, I just thought he lost his footing in the mud.
But then the deep rubber treads of his boots suddenly vanished. Right there in their place, stamped clearly into the freezing clay, were bare human footprints. It defied all human logic. I froze. My light was literally shaking in my hand. He had taken off his boots. Why in God's name would a man running for his life in the freezing cold stop to take off his boots?
I found the boots discarded a few yards away in the brush.
They weren't thrown or kicked off in a panic. They were sitting perfectly upright in the mud, side by side, neatly arranged, like he carefully took them off before stepping into the freezing water. I shined my light back onto the bare footprints. The toes were deeply splayed, digging frantically into the mud.
I kept following them.
10 yards, 20 yards, 50 yards. And as I walked, I realized the stride was changing again. The distance between the bare footsteps was growing impossibly long. It was stretching out way further than any normal person could reach. No human being, no matter how athletic, could leap 8 feet between strides, but the footprints were doing exactly that. I just crouched there in the freezing dark. My mind was desperately trying to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. And then the very shape of the foot began to warp. I stopped dead in my tracks. I crouched over a perfectly clear print in the soft clay. It was no longer a human foot. The 5 toes had fused together into 2 distinct, jagged halves. The heel had elongated, extending sharply upward and backward. It was a hoof, a massive split hoof, the size of a large dinner plate. I followed the next step. The hoof print was even larger. It was stamped so violently deep into the earth that whatever made it had to weigh over 600 pounds. I stared at it, my mind desperately trying to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. A massive wild boar? A freakishly large elk? But the progression was undeniable. I had followed a single continuous trail, step by step. There was no break in the tracks. No sign of another animal crossing his path. I watched the hiking boots turn into bare feet. And I watched the bare feet slowly stretch, fracture, and morph into the heavy, cloven hooves of a monster. It was a transformation that defied all logic. A wave of absolute primal terror washed over me. And the kind of terror that makes your blood feel like ice water. It makes your lungs completely forget how to pull in air. I was paralyzed by the impossible truth. Nothing was chasing Thomas. Thomas was not running from a predator. Thomas was the perimeter. I stood up slowly, my headlamp slicing through the suffocating pitch-black darkness of the ravine. I was miles from civilization, entirely alone. I was tracking a man who had somehow shed his humanity like a cheap suit. The silence of the woods pressed in on me. I raised my heavy revolver, pulling back the hammer with a loud metallic click. My hands were trembling violently. I knew I had to turn back. I had to walk away, climb out of that hollow, and never speak of this to another living soul. But before I could take a single step back, a sound echoed through the frozen trees. It was a voice. It just said, "Help me." It came from the dense brush just beyond the reach of my headlamp. The voice was weak, raspy, and filled with terrible agony.
It sounded exactly like Thomas.
"I'm hurt," the voice called out again, vibrating through the dead, still air. "Please, my leg is broken." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird.
Every survival instinct I had honed over 35 years was screaming at me to run.
Screaming at me to fire blindly into the dark and just flee.
But the human part of me, the part that remembered the man who used to be my closest friend, hesitated.
"Thomas?" I called out.
My voice cracked, completely betraying my overwhelming fear.
The woods went instantly, violently silent.
The wind didn't blow. Even the sound of the trickling creek seemed to just vanish into the void.
Then the voice spoke again.
But this time, it wasn't weak. It wasn't in pain.
It was right behind me.
And it was mocking me.
"I was the one who mapped the route," the voice whispered.
It perfectly mimicked the exact lie Thomas had told the federal investigators years ago. He simply followed my instructions. I spun around, raising the revolver. The bright beam of my headlamp swept frantically across the massive trunks of the old-growth trees. But there was nothing there. Just empty, suffocating darkness.
"You wanted to see me fail," the voice echoed, this time coming from high up in the branches to my left. The pitch of the voice was dropping, distorting. It took on a wet, guttural resonance that vibrated deep in my chest.
You wanted the mountains to humble me.
It was pulling the deepest, darkest thoughts straight out of my own head.
It knew exactly why I was out here. It knew my bitterness, my pride, my petty desire for revenge. And it was feeding on it. "Show yourself," I yelled, trying to project a fierce authority I didn't feel. My finger tightened dangerously on the trimmer. The heavy brush finally parted. About 40 feet away, right at the edge of my fading light, something stepped out from behind a massive oak tree. It was tall, impossibly, horrifyingly tall. It stood on two legs, but they were bent backward at the knee, ending in those massive, heavy hooves. Its torso was pale and unnaturally long. The skin was stretched tight over a starving skeletal frame covered in thick patches of matted hair and dried mud. But it was the face that nearly broke my mind. It was a grotesque, melting mockery of Thomas, twisted into something ancient and wrong. The eyes were his, but they were pushed way too far apart on the skull. They were wide and completely black, reflecting my headlamp like polished obsidian. Its jaw hung open at a broken angle, showing rows of jagged teeth that didn't belong in a human mouth. It didn't breathe. It didn't even blink. It just stood there, towering in the freezing dark. It stared down at me with this ancient, bottomless malice, completely unbothered by the gun. The mountains hadn't humbled Thomas. They had simply recognized the deep rot inside his soul. The overwhelming greed, the casual betrayal, the absolute willingness to sacrifice others for his own gain. The deep wilderness doesn't judge you by your bank account or your charming smile. It strips away all the comfortable lies and reveals exactly what you are underneath. Thomas was a monster in the civilized world, hiding behind a handsome face and a silver tongue. Haunting conclusion. The ancient woods simply gave him a physical body to match his soul. It took one heavy step toward me. That massive hoof slammed into the frozen dirt. I felt the sickening thud right through the soles of my boots. Then it raised this long, spindly arm. It pointed a horrific clawed finger right at my chest. And it called me silent partner. It was Thomas's arrogant voice, bubbling up from that ruined throat. It was daring me to shoot. It wanted me to let all that anger, all that deep resentment just take over. It was practically begging me to pull the trigger and end it. But I knew if I fired that gun, I'd never leave that valley alive.
If I engaged with it out of pure hatred, I was done for. I'd be dragged right down into the exact same twisted curse that swallowed him.
The woods were handing me my revenge on a silver platter.
But the price was my own humanity. I stared into those bottomless black eyes, and I slowly lowered my revolver. I didn't break eye contact for a single second. I refused to show it the violent anger it so desperately wanted to feed on.
I just swallowed all that bitter, toxic pride that brought me out there.
I told him he was dead to me. My voice was barely a whisper, but it was completely steady.
I told him he always was.
Then I took one deliberate step backward. The creature just tilted its horrific head.
Its jaw snapped shut with this awful, wet crunch.
It seemed completely confused by my lack of aggression, like it didn't know what to do if I wasn't fighting back. I took another step back, then another.
I didn't turn my back, and I sure as hell didn't run.
I walked backward through that freezing brush for hours, keeping my light on it until the darkness swallowed it whole.
I hiked straight through the night.
I never stopped to rest, never drank water, and never looked over my shoulder.
The sun was finally coming up when I breached the tree line and found my truck. I drove straight to Eleanor's house in town.
She opened the door before I even knocked.
Her exhausted eyes searched my dirt-streaked face, begging for any tiny sign of hope. I looked at this grieving, desperate woman, knowing I could never tell her the truth. I couldn't tell her that Thomas was still out there. He was wandering those freezing hollows as a grotesque nightmare. The truth would have completely destroyed her mind. So I gave her the only piece of mercy I had left to give.
I lied.
I told her he slipped in the dark and that the fall was quick. I watched the very last spark of hope die in her eyes. It was instantly replaced by the crushing weight of permanent closure. She cried, thanked me for trying, and hugged me. I walked away, drove back to my cabin, and packed my things. By the end of the week, I was completely out of the state. I don't guide anymore. I don't hike. I don't even go camping. People love to romanticize the wilderness. They look at the towering pines and the rolling fog of the Appalachians, and they see pure poetry. They see a pristine paradise to escape their modern lives. But they don't understand that the deep woods are a mirror. If you walk into the ancient dark, carrying hidden greed and a rotten soul, the forest sees it. It pulls that sickness out and turns you into what you truly are. There are places out there where the paved roads end and cell service dies. Places where the rules of human civilization just don't apply anymore. There are ancient boundaries you should never, ever cross. If you're ever on an unmarked trail at sunset and the woods go completely terrifyingly silent, don't wait around. Turn around, walk back toward the light, and never, ever answer a voice that calls your name from the dark. If you ask tourists why the rangers lock the heavy steel gates to the deeper trails at sundown, they'll tell you it's to protect people from the bears. Let them believe that. It took a long time for that deep chill to finally leave my bones. Moving out west kind of saved me. Out here, the sky is wide open, and shadows just don't have anywhere to hide. You never really forget what looks back at you from the dark. Those memories still visit me sometimes, but they don't own me anymore. Survival is about learning how to live again when the sun comes up. We're a lot like the earth itself, honestly. You can get broken wide open by storms you never saw coming. But give it enough time, and things start to grow back. The scars stay, but they just make the foundation stronger. I still think about Eleanor a lot. I really hope that lie I told her gave her some kind of peace. Sometimes you gotta bury the truth so someone else can keep walking.
Thomas let his greed eat away at everything that made him human.
Now he's just the permanent part of that dark.
It's tragic, but the mountains always demand their balance.
Even after everything, I can't hate those mountains.
They're ancient, and they just don't care about our little human problems.
They've weathered millions of years of storms without ever bowing down. The wild demands absolute respect. Modern life tries to make us forget that. When you step off the pavement, you're just a guest in a very old house. I might not guide anymore, but I still share what the woods taught me. I write down the old ways, the quiet rules of the backcountry.
It's my way of making sure the next generation keeps their eyes wide open. If there's one thing I learned, it's that we're stronger than we think. When the cold sets in, there's a fire inside us that just refuses to go out. That resilience is the best survival tool you'll ever have.
So let the tourists have their brochures. Let the rangers lock those heavy steel gates at dusk.
The wild will always be out there testing us. But as long as we remember who we are, we'll always find our way back to the light.
I still see Eleanor's face sometimes when I close my eyes.
The way that last spark of hope died when I told her that lie.
It was a crushing weight, but the truth would have shattered her mind. Some secrets are too dark for the daylight. People ask how I sleep, knowing what's wandering those freezing hollows. The truth is, I don't sleep much.
When the wind rattles the glass, I swear I hear that guttural voice calling my name.
You don't walk away from that unchanged.
The Smokies are a masterpiece of green pines and rushing rivers.
Millions drive through every year, breathing the fresh air. They see a pristine paradise.
They have no idea what's waiting just beyond the tree line.
I watch city folks hike paved trails with expensive gear and arrogant smiles.
They think a titanium water filter means they've conquered the wild. They treat ancient timber like an amusement park. But the deep woods don't care about your bank account.
The wilderness is a mirror reflecting what you are underneath those comfortable lies. Walk in with a rotten soul, and the forest smells that sickness.
Thomas was a monster long before he stepped into Blackwood Hollow. His greed and betrayal had already twisted her. Those ancient woods simply stripped away his handsome face and gave him a body to match his soul.
That's the true danger of unmapped trails. It isn't black bears or winter storms you need to fear. It's the ancient rules of the forest that demand absolute humility.
Cross those boundaries with arrogance, and you pay the ultimate price.
I spent 35 years learning to track a man through the thickest brush.
But the most important lesson was knowing exactly when to stop tracking and turn around. Some trails are meant to be lost forever. There are places where cell service dies and the rules of civilization simply don't apply.
If you're on a lonely trail at dusk and the woods go terrifyingly silent around you, do not wait around.
Turn around.
Walk back toward the light.
And never answer a voice calling your name from the dark.
Those steel gates are locked at sundown for a reason. It's to keep you away from things that don't belong in brochures.
Every evening, the park rangers perform a quiet ritual.
They swing those heavy steel gates shut across the access roads. The sound of the locks clicking echoes down the valleys. They tell everyone it's just for bear safety. It's a simple, comfortable rule to keep the public happy.
Families pack up and head down the mountain. They drive toward the bright lights of Gatlinburg.
Looking out, they just see a beautiful backdrop, a perfect postcard for their vacations. They have no idea what those gates hold back. As the sun dips, the temperature plummets.
That famous rolling fog bleeds into the valleys.
Smokies stopped being a welcoming national park.
They turn into an ancient, isolated fortress. The paved roads end, and the wilderness takes over.
Deep inside the restricted zones, the silence returns.
The birds stop singing, and the wind dies.
It's heavy, suffocating kind of quiet.
A silence from long before human civilization.
Out there, our rules simply don't apply.
The forest floor is a graveyard of rotting logs.
Built on secrets buried under decaying leaves.
The woods act as a perfect, unforgiving mirror. They absorb everything that enters them.
They judge the intent of every living creature.
If you bring arrogance into the deep timber, the mountains know.
They can literally smell the sickness on you.
They won't offer you peace or a scenic escape.
They'll pull that darkness right out of you and mold it into something absolutely terrifying. Somewhere in that ravine, a hoof presses into the mud, leaving a track no ranger will ever document.
The thing that was Thomas is still out there,
wandering endlessly through the freezing hollows, trapped in a nightmare of its own making.
It stands perfectly still among the barren winter trees.
Those wide, black eyes reflecting the faint moonlight,
Just waiting in the suffocating darkness.
listening for footsteps wandering off the trail.
A permanent monument to the cost of betrayal.
I live hundreds of miles away now, out in flat country where I can see the horizon.
I don't even own hiking boots anymore.
And I never walk near a tree line after dusk.
But distance doesn't erase the memory of what I saw.
The Great Smoky Mountains have stood for millions of years. They are incredibly patient and completely unforgiving. And they are always watching. So let the tourists believe those gates are for the bears.
Trust me, it's better that way. We build our cities and pave our roads, thinking we've finally conquered the wild.
We wrap ourselves in this comfortable little illusion of safety. But the deep timber doesn't care about our concrete or our technology.
People walk into the woods with satellite phones and $1,000 jackets.
They think a GPS signal makes them invincible.
But the second that battery dies, you're right back at the bottom of the food chain.
These mountains are built like a natural trap.
The hollows are deep, and the ravines plunge straight down into the dark. Take 10 steps off the marked trail, and every single tree starts looking exactly the same. A healthy forest is loud, full of birds and wind.
When it goes dead quiet, your instincts know a predator is close.
But the silence in Blackwood Hollow isn't just a predator. It's something ancient, holding its breath.
When the sun drops behind those ridges, the darkness is absolute.
Your eyes start lying to you as shadows twist into shapes.
That isolation takes every regret you have and amplifies it until you can't think straight.
The worst part isn't the dark. It's what calls out from inside it.
It uses the voices of people you care about, begging for help.
It weaponizes your own empathy just to pull you off the trail.
You see those faded missing posters pinned up at the ranger stations.
Smiling faces of people who just wanted a weekend in nature.
Their families are still waiting for answers, never knowing the woods took them for a reason.
I still think about Eleanor, living with the lie I told her. Telling her the truth about Thomas would have broken her mind. Sometimes a clean lie is the only mercy you have left to give.
I live out in the flat country now, where I can see for miles.
But some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat. I lie there swearing I can hear a heavy split hoof on my front porch.
So we put up our heavy steel gates and lock them at sundown. We tell the tourists it's for their own protection against the bears.
It's a fragile little barrier between our safe, logical world and the ancient dark. I packed up my life and moved out of the state by the end of that week. I don't guide anymore.
I don't hike. I don't even go camping. People love to romanticize the wilderness, you know?
They look at the towering pines and the rolling fog, and they just see pure poetry. They think it's this untouched paradise where they can escape the modern world. But they don't understand what's actually out there.
The deep woods aren't just some pretty backdrop for your weekend getaway.
The forest is a mirror.
If you walk into that deep timber with a clean heart and a humble mind, you might just walk out in peace.
The woods respect a respectful spirit. But if you walk into the ancient dark carrying hidden greed or cold betrayal,
the forest is going to see it.
It can smell the sickness hidden inside you.
And it won't hesitate to pull that sickness right out of you. It'll mold it.
It'll turn you into exactly what you truly are, underneath all those comfortable lies. There are places out there where the paved roads just end,
where your cell service dies, and the rules of human civilization simply do not apply anymore.
There are ancient boundaries out in those hollows, lines drawn deep in the dirt by nature itself.
lines that you should never, ever cross.
If you ever find yourself walking on a lonely, unmarked trail as the sun starts going down, and you notice the woods going completely, terrifyingly silent around you,
Don't wait around to see what comes creeping out of the brush.
turn around, walk back toward the light as fast as you can.
And never, ever answer a voice that calls your name from the dark.
If you ever take a trip down to the Great Smoky Mountains, you'll notice something. Right around sundown, the park rangers start clearing everyone out. They pull these heavy steel gates across the deeper trails. They lock those padlocks tight, and they don't mess around with stragglers. If you ask the tourists why they do it, they all give the same answer.
They'll tell you it's to protect people from the black bears. And honestly, you should just let them believe that.
It's a really comforting, easily digestible lie. It lets those folks go back to their warm cabins and sleep soundly through the night.
A bear is a natural predator, something the modern mind can easily comprehend.
It's an animal that follows the basic, predictable rules of biology and nature.
It's scary, sure, but it's a fear that makes logical sense.
But the truth is, those heavy steel gates are not there to keep the wildlife away from you.
The Park Service knows exactly what happens when people wander too far off the map.
They know what's really out there now. Those gates are there to keep you away from the things that do not belong in the wildlife brochures.
The things that don't leave normal tracks in the mud. The things that wait in the freezing dark.
I spent 35 years learning every hidden ridge in this mountain range.
I've survived flash floods and predators that would make a city man freeze. But I will never step foot in those woods after dark again. Because I know what the deep timber does to a person who carries a rotten soul. I know that the ancient woods are a mirror, and they will pull your hidden sickness right out of you. So if you're ever out there, and you suddenly notice the forest going completely, terrifyingly silent, do not wait around to see what comes creeping out of the brush. Don't try to be a hero. Just turn around, walk back toward the light, and never answer a voice that calls your name.
And if someone asks about the locked gates,
Just tell them it's for the bears.
I don't guide anymore. I don't hike. I don't even go camping.
I've seen enough of what's out there to know better.
People romanticize the wilderness. They look at the towering green pines, the rushing rivers, and the rolling fog, and they see pure poetry. They see a pristine, untouched paradise.
A place where they can just escape the stress of their modern lives.
But they don't understand that the deep woods are a mirror. They reflect exactly what you bring into them. If you walk into the deep timber with a clean heart, a humble mind, and a respectful spirit,
You might just walk out in peace.
but if you walk into the ancient dark, carrying hidden greed, cold betrayal, and a rotten soul,
The forest is going to see it.
it'll smell the sickness hidden inside you. And it won't hesitate to pull that sickness out, mold it, and turn you into exactly what you truly are. There are places in this country where the paved roads end, the cell service dies, and the rules of human civilization simply do not apply. There are ancient boundaries you should never, ever cross. If you ever find yourself walking on a lonely, unmarked trail as the sun begins to set, and you suddenly notice the woods going completely, terrifyingly silent around you,
Don't wait around to see what comes creeping out of the brush.
turn around. Walk back toward the light. And never, ever answer a voice that calls your name from the dark. And if you ever hear a voice calling your name from the pitch black, you keep walking. Don't you ever answer it. Just keep your eyes forward and get out of there. Because there are things out there that just don't belong in the glossy park brochures. Things the modern world likes to pretend don't exist. But the old-timers, we know better. You go down to the main visitor center and ask the tourists. Find out why the rangers are so strict about the trail curfews. They'll all give you the exact same answer. They'll tell you it's just standard park policy. They'll say the rangers are just doing their jobs, keeping everyone safe from the local wildlife. It's a nice, easy explanation to swallow. They watch those heavy steel gates swing shut right at sundown. They hear the thick chains rattling and the padlocks clicking into place. And they don't think twice about it. They think those gates are there to keep the animals away from the paved hiking trails, to keep the natural world neatly separated from the civilized one. It makes them feel secure when they go to sleep. They'll tell you with a straight face that it's all just to protect people from the black bears. That a hungry bear is the absolute worst thing you can run into out there. And honestly, it's a comforting lie. It's a lot easier to sleep in your nylon tent when you think the only danger is a bear looking for a candy bar.
It keeps the panic down.
So, let them believe that. Let them take their pictures, buy their little souvenirs, and go home safe. They don't need to know what's really breathing in the dark. Some secrets are better left buried deep in the hollows. Because once you see what's really out there, you can never, ever unsee it. I don't guide anymore.
I don't hike, and I sure as hell don't go camping.
People look at these mountains and see pure poetry, a perfect escape from the modern world. They see the towering pines, the rushing rivers, and that rolling fog. They think it's just this untouched paradise where they can leave all their stress behind. But they don't get.
The deep woods, they're a mirror.
If you walk in with a clean heart and a humble spirit, you might just walk out in peace. But if you're carrying hidden greed or a rotten soul, the forest is going to see it. It'll smell that sickness hiding inside you, and it won't hesitate to pull it right out. It'll mold it and turn you into exactly what you truly are underneath. There are places out here where the paved roads just end, where your cell service dies, and the rules of human civilization simply don't apply anymore. Those are ancient boundaries you should never, ever cross. If you ever find yourself walking on some lonely, unmarked trail right around sunset, and you suddenly notice the woods going completely, terrifyingly silent around you, don't wait around to see what comes creeping out of the brush. Just turn around. Walk as fast as you can back toward the light. Don't look over your shoulder, and whatever you do, don't stop moving until you hit the pavement. And whatever you do, if you hear something out there, Never, ever answer a voice that calls your name from the dark.
Even if it sounds exactly like someone you love.
So, if you ask the tourists why the park rangers lock those heavy steel gates at sundown, they'll tell you it's just to protect people from the black bears.
It's a nice, easy story to swallow.
Let them believe that. It's a whole lot better they don't know what's really waiting out there in the freezing dark.
Some secrets are just meant to stay buried.
Some nights, when the wind blows down from the high ridges, I can still hear the ice cracking in that ravine.
It's a heavy sound that gets right into your bones.
A dark warning, a cold reminder that some things don't ever really stay buried.
They always say time heals all wounds, but out there in the deep timber, time just freezes them in place. The mountains don't ever forget the people they swallow up.
They just wait patiently for the next one.
I still think about those expensive boots sometimes, sitting perfectly upright in the freezing mud, like they belonged in a store window.
It was the exact moment a man decided he just didn't need to be human anymore.
Blackwood Hollow is still strictly closed to the public, and it always will be. The rangers blame it on unstable terrain and aggressive wildlife to keep folks away. But the older guys on the patrol, they know exactly what's down there. They know there's a deep, ancient sickness buried in that soil. A hungry, formless thing that feeds on the absolute worst parts of our nature.
And no matter how many people it takes, it's always starving.
I've made my peace with what I did, and why I walked away. Or at least, I've finally learned how to live with the heavy quiet. Bitter truth, but finding peace isn't exactly the same thing as earning forgiveness. I keep all my old gear locked away in a dusty chest now.
The heavy guns, the topographic maps, the compasses.
They're just tools for a brutal world I don't belong to anymore. People are going to keep coming to these mountains year after year. They'll keep chasing that pristine, untouched paradise to escape their modern lives. And, thankfully, most of them will go home completely safe. But there's always someone who thinks they're bigger and smarter than the woods. Someone who steps off the marked trail, thinking the rules just don't apply to them. Dark promise. That's exactly who the forest is waiting for. If you're ever out there and the birds suddenly stop singing around you, just remember what's waiting on the other side of the dark, and turn around, and let the bears take the blame. There are places in this country where the paved roads end, and the rules of human civilization simply do not apply. There are ancient boundaries you should never, ever cross. If you ever find yourself walking on a lonely, unmarked trail as the sun begins to set, and you suddenly notice the woods going completely, terrifyingly silent around you, the wind dies, the birds vanish, and the air gets heavy, do not wait around to see what comes creeping out of the brush.
Turn around.
Walk back toward the light. Don't let your pride or your curiosity keep you out there. Just get back to where things make sense. Because the things that live in those deep hollows know exactly how to sound like someone you love. So keep walking, and never, ever answer a voice that calls your name from the dark. If you ask the tourists why the park rangers lock the heavy steel gates to the deeper trails at sundown, they'll tell you it's to protect people from the black bears. It's a comforting lie. Let them believe that.